All right. Okay. So yeah, as I said, I'm just going to give kind of a broad overview of this stuff. And a lot of people are not going to take the time to learn this because it isn't easy and it takes some thinking. It takes some mental effort. But you're here because you want to learn how to defend your faith better. And this is central to defending your faith, knowing how to think well and think carefully about these issues and respond well to objections. So that kind of touches on why we should care about logic. But yeah, Christians in particular should care about logic because logic is what's called a normative discipline. And what I mean by normative is that it's how we ought to do something, how we ought to think. Um, so when you see these logical structures later, those are indications of how arguments should work and how to make a proper argument and put it in a proper form. Now, another thing is that logic also helps us weed through true beliefs and false beliefs, or it helps us to organize our thoughts in a way that's more conducive to recognizing what's true and what's false. And as Christians, obviously, we need to care about the truth, right? I mean, Jesus said he was the way, the truth, and the life. And so we don't need to be afraid of logic at all. I know some Christians are worried that, oh, if I learn about logic, maybe it will make me question my faith. No, if Christianity is true, then anything that helps us come to truth or know truth better is going to be an asset to us. It's going to help us share our faith better and even understand things about scripture or God better. So this is very important. Now, what is logic? Well, many people use the term logic kind of colloquially in everyday talk in a way that it means something like you're thinking rationally, or they say, well, you're not being logical. It's like, well, you're being irrational, or your thinking's not clear. But that isn't what logic is in the way I'm using it here. Logic is a specific system of arguments. It's basically like math. It's a formulation of how an argument should be. Now, the picture you see on the screen here, this is called a modus ponens argument. We'll get into that a little bit later. Sorry, this is a modus tollens argument. We'll get into that a little bit later. Don't stress about that. But yeah, basically logic is just a form of an argument or different forms of arguments that we can use. And well, now we can define what an argument is. Well, an argument, contrary to also how it's kind of used in the general discussion, is not being argumentative. It's not me going and attacking somebody or anything like that. It's just me defending my conclusion with premises. So you'll see that here. All mammals have hair. Cats are mammals, therefore cats have hair. This is an argument. So you can see I have my two premises here. All mammals have hair. Cats are mammals. And then my conclusion, cats have hair. And in this argument form, if my premises here are true, premise one and premise two, then the conclusion necessarily follows, which means that if you can establish your premises with certainty, your conclusion will be certain. And logic actually is a certain, it involves 100% certainty, these logical forms, just like mathematics, 2 plus 2 equals 4. It's the same thing with logic. However, this doesn't mean that if I put an argument into this form, that it's going to be certain that my conclusion is true. It just means that I followed the proper logical form. Now, here's another example of an argument in a different form. The first one I showed you was from categorical logic. There's different types of logic. So if we go back here, this is dealing with categories, all and some cats, and then some cats. So In categorical logic, you have these all propositions or some propositions or no propositions. Now, the second one here is from propositional logic, and you don't really need to know these terms or anything. I'm just kind of going through the weeds a little bit, so you'll be familiar with some of the terminology. So yeah, this is a like I said, this is from propositional logic or dealing with sentences. And this goes, the disciples in reporting the resurrection were either deceived, deceivers, or correct that Jesus rose physically from the dead. The disciples were not deceived or deceivers. Therefore, we only have one option left. They were correct that Jesus rose physically from the dead. So again, if either of these premises are true, then the conclusion here must also be true. And by the way, this is actually how I like to formulate the argument for the resurrection. I like to use this argument form, or what's called the syllogism, which is just another word for an argument. But this is how I like to argue for the resurrection. So if you look at our first few options here, they're either deceived or deceivers. If you can show those are not plausible, then it follows that Jesus did rise physically. So you can put that in your toolkit and use it another time. Now, there's two main types of arguments. There's inductive, and then there's deductive arguments. And deductive arguments are ones in which the premises they must follow from the the conclusion must follow from the premises. So as we've been showing already, I used only deductive arguments so far. So once again, the conclusion necessarily follows from the premises. If someone starts attacking your conclusion, that's not a proper way to refute your argument. They must attack one of the premises. So if they accept these premises, they must accept the conclusion also. So if you take an argument for God, for example, there's the Kalam cosmological argument that if whatever begins to exist has a cause, the universe began to exist, therefore the universe has a cause. So the conclusion of that argument is that the universe has a cause. So if you're going to refute that argument, you can't just say, well, I don't think the universe has a cause. You have to go back to those first two premises and refute one of those. Now, look at this argument I put here below, and you'll notice that it's quite a bad argument. If I live in Finland, then I live in Stockholm. I live in Finland, therefore I live in Stockholm. Now, this argument's obviously false, right? But if these premises were true, then the conclusion that I live in Stockholm would also be true. However, these premises are false, so the conclusion's also false. But this kind of gets into an argument being sound versus valid, which we're going to cover in a minute. Now, inductive arguments are kind of the opposite of a deductive argument, that the conclusion of an inductive argument, they don't follow necessarily from the premises. And inductive arguments generally concern probability. So take this argument here. The sun has set and risen every day I have been alive. Therefore, the sun will probably rise tomorrow. Well, it's possible that the sun won't rise tomorrow. It's possible that, a number of things could happen. However, given, the amount of times you've seen the sun set and rise, it's very likely that the sun will do the same tomorrow. So take another example of an argument against God's existence. And this is an argument from evil. And I'll try to define these terms. So if an omnibenevolent, meaning an all good, omniscient, all knowing, omnipotent, all powerful being, God, exists, then God would have a morally good reason for allowing evil. Premise 2, we do not see any morally good reason for God allowing evil. Therefore, probably God does not exist. Now, this argument is inductive, which means that it cannot establish that God does not exist with certainty from the premises. It can only say it's probable. So, what you can do with an argument like this is you can look at these and say, is there any good reason to accept these to be true? For example, would God always need a morally good reason for allowing evil? Maybe you think he would. Okay, so maybe that premise seems true. Well, let's look at our second premise. We do not see any morally good reason. You could either say that we do see a morally good reason, and you could refute this premise, or you could say we do not have any reason to think that we would know whether there's a morally good reason or God has one, or whether we could see all the reasons God would have. So uh, the good thing about knowing the difference between deductive and inductive is you can say, well, okay, it only follows that God probably doesn't exist here. But you can say, but I have all this other evidence that God does exist. And so that would actually um, go to outweigh this one argument against God, because you could say, well, I have all these other reasons. So that's one way to refute this. But yeah, basically deductive, the conclusion follows with certainty from the premises, and in the inductive, it doesn't. It only deals with probability. Now, one more important thing about inductive arguments is that the strength of an inductive argument depends on your what's called your reference class. So for example, if I live in Helsinki, and let's say that I looked at all the ravens in Helsinki, I studied all the landscape, and I did it over the course of maybe 20 years. I read lots of books and received lots of testimony from other individuals. And I determined that all this testimony I've received and everything I've seen, all the ravens I've seen have been black. Well, that's a lot of background information and knowledge I have to make a conclusion that probably all the ravens in Helsinki are black. But if I maybe lived in Helsinki just a week and I was only in, one neighborhood, and all the ravens I saw there were black, that wouldn't be a large reference class to decide that, well, all the ravens in Helsinki are black. So good inductive arguments, they need a lot of kind of evidential weight behind them to be successful. And again, the more they have, the stronger they are. Now, we're going to deal with what's called a sound argument and what's a valid argument. So arguments, they can actually be valid and not be sound. Take this argument here. All cats have brains. Some rocks are cats. Some rocks have brains. Now, looking at this, would you think that this is a valid argument? Well, probably not, right? But it is actually a valid argument. It's in the proper logical form because it follows all A's are B's, some C's are A's, some C's are B's. So as long as whatever you plug in here fits into this logical form, it's a valid argument, no matter what the premises are, even if they're completely wrong. Here's another example. If I live in Finland, then I'm an extroverted person. I am not an extroverted person. I do not live in Finland. Well, these premises are obviously false, right? And but this follows the proper logical form you'll see here, and I'll explain what this is in a minute. Don't be bogged down by it. But yeah, this follows the proper logical form, so it's a valid argument. Now that gets us into soundness. So an argument being valid and being sound are two different things. For an argument to be sound, the premises must be true, and it has to follow the right logical form. And once again, if you have any questions along the way, feel free to interrupt me and ask. So we can actually put this argument, we can put this into an argument, the idea that an argument is sound only when it is true and valid. So if the premises of the argument are true, then the conclusion must also be true. The premises of the argument are true, therefore the conclusion of the argument must also be true. So yeah, I put sort of this idea into, or rather these philosophers put it into a logical argument. So yeah, soundness, you need true premises and it needs to follow the proper logical form. And an argument can be valid, but have false premises. All an argument needs to be valid is to follow the proper logical form. Now, I'm going to throw this in as well because it's important. An argument doesn't need to be certain for it to be successful. So take take the argument that I used before. Whatever begins to exist must have a cause. The universe began to exist, therefore, in conclusion, the universe must have a cause. None of those premises, either that if the universe began to exist, it had to have a cause, or if the universe had a cause, began to exist, those don't need to be certain for them to be successful. All they need is to be, they're more likely to be true than not for the argument to be successful. To require that they are certain, that's just too high of a burden of proof. Meaning it's just too, that's expecting too much for the argument to be successful, because we know lots of things that aren't certain. You know, take for example that the sun will rise tomorrow. Well, we can know that the sun's going to rise tomorrow, but it's not certain that that will happen. So once again, an argument doesn't need to be certain for it to be successful. It just needs to be more likely to be true than not. Now we're going to get into the argument forms, and this might be a little bit confusing, so please just ask questions if you need to. When you see these symbols, they look kind of confusing at first, but they're actually really easy once you just understand what they are. So our first argument form is what's called a modus ponens argument. This is the most basic form of an argument, and people use this all the time without even knowing. Now, these symbols here, they just are representative of a part of an argument. So this portion here, this is the first part, P. So let's say, let me think of an argument. If I live in Helsinki, then I live in Finland. So if P, then Q. I live in Helsinki. That's the first thing here. And then in conclusion, that's what this means. It's kind of like you're adding these premises together and then it equals Q, right? So let's go through this one more time. So if I live in Helsinki, that's P. Then this means then I live in Finland, and that's Q. And the second premise just reasserts P. I live in Helsinki. And then you have your conclusion. Therefore, I live in Finland, and that's Q. I hope that makes sense. Is anyone not clear on this? Okay. Now, you also need to know these terms of what these are called in logic. So the P here, this is called the antecedent. So it's what is the first part of your first premise. That's the antecedent. And then the Q is called the consequent. That's what follows from the antecedent. So how this argument works is you have your antecedent and follows the Q. You reassert your antecedent P, and then you end up with your consequent Q. Now, every modus ponens argument, every argument in this form, it needs to affirm the antecedent. So you must affirm P for it to be in modus ponens form and for it to be a valid argument. So if I said that, let's say I did if P, then Q, and then I said Q, therefore P, that would not be a valid argument. That's actually a fallacy. And hold on, I think I may get into that later on. Maybe not. But yeah, so you must affirm the antecedent, the P. You cannot affirm the Q. To give you an example, let's say I had the argument, if it rains, then the ground will be wet. And let's say I affirmed Q and I said, the ground is wet, therefore P, it rained. Well, that's not a valid argument, right? Because the ground could be wet and it still would not have rained. There could be other reasons why the ground is wet, right? So yeah. So you need to affirm P in order for this to be a valid argument. And here's a good example. So if you're familiar with the Kalam cosmological argument, we did a lot of work on this in our chapter already. And I've already mentioned this a few times, but this follows the modus ponens form. If the universe began to exist, P, then the universe has a cause, Q. The universe began to exist, P, therefore Q, the universe has a cause. Now, the next argument form is called the modus tollens. And this is very similar to the modus tollens. A saying people like to use is one man's modus ponens is another man's modus tollens. Now that's probably about the nerdiest joke you've ever heard, but you'll kind of get it as we go along. This picture here is of Alvin Plantinga. He's one of my favorite Christian philosophers. Yeah. So this is the modus tollens argument, and it's very similar to what we already went over with modus ponens. So if P, then Q. Now the difference, if you'll notice here, this symbol means not. It just means you're denying the consequent here. I'm denying Q. So instead of the modus ponens, if P, then Q, P, therefore Q, I'm just doing if P, then Q. Not Q, therefore not P. Now, to see how this works, let's give you another example, and I'll take the same argument I've already used. However, I'll just put it into the modus tollens form. So if the universe began to exist, then the universe has a cause, right? This is the same premise we already had above. But this time I'm going to deny the Q consequent here. So the universe does not have a cause, not Q. Therefore, the universe did not begin to exist. Now, that idea above, that one man's modus ponens is another man's modus tollens. So if I gave that argument as I initially had it here, right? If the universe began to exist, then the universe has a cause. The universe began to exist, therefore the universe has a cause. Someone else could go and try to refute that argument by denying the consequent here. They could just say the universe does not have a cause, and then give us reasons why we should accept that, and then it would follow that the universe didn't begin to exist. So they're very related, and you really need to know those forms because they're really important. And if you know them, then you can use them kind of against each other. Maybe an atheist would use some argument against evil in this kind of form. And if you know your forms, then you can just make a modus ponens to refute their modus tollens, or you can make a modus tollens to refute their modus ponens. And so it's really important to know those two basic structures. Now take a look at this argument. So let's go back. Remember our form here. If P, then Q, not Q. Therefore, not P. Now, does this actually deny the Q here? Does it say that the Q is not the case? So if an all good God exists, then evil does not exist. Evil does exist. Therefore, God does not exist. Now, from looking at this, does anyone want to take a stab at whether this is actually, or explain why this is in the modus tollens form? right? This is our form, right? We're supposed to say not the Q. Does this argument do that? Does anyone want to take a stab at it? Go ahead, Joe.
I think evil does not exist is your, so it's if an all good God exists, so all good God exists is P,
Yeah,
evil does not exist is Q,
right.
and then evil does exist is not Q. Therefore, God, although obviously there's a difference between saying God does not exist and all good God does not exist.
Sure.
Um,
Yeah, that's a
yeah,
good
yeah, yeah.
that's a good point. I should have typed that out. Um, but yeah, that's right. That's right. So even though my Q here is negative, that evil does not exist, I'm still denying Q, right? It just becomes a positive statement. And the reason why this is you can see this here, right? So these symbols just mean not. So if I have not P, that's the same as P, right? So if I said God does not exist, that would be not P, not God. But if I say not God doesn't exist, right? That's a double negation, and so it just turns into God does exist, or P. And so that's what's happening here. This is just a not evil, and then I'm saying not evil, so it just turns to evil does exist. So these are your rules. That's a good rule to remember in logic. If you have a double negation, a double not before a Q or a P, that's the same as just P or Q. Now, this is our final argument form. Sorry, this is a little bit blurry. It's always hard to tell when I'm putting this together on my computer if it's going to show up well in the presentation. So this is called a hypothetical syllogism. And so a syllogism, once again, it's just another word for an argument. It sounds fancy, but just means it's an argument. That's all it is. And this is very similar to what we saw above. And again, sorry, this is a little bit unclear. It's very similar to modus ponens. It's just if P, then Q. If Q, then R. P, therefore R. So if you have these two, right, then it follows that if P is the case, then R will also be the case. To give you an example of this, if God is loving, then he will always do what is best for me. If God will always do what is best for me, then I can trust him. God is loving, therefore I can trust him. So we have this here. If P, right? If God is loving, then he will always do. If God is loving, and then Q, then he will always do what's best for me. If Q, if God will always do what's best for me, right? We've taken this above. Then R, then I can trust him. And then we affirm P, God is loving, and then we end up with R, therefore I can trust him. So any argument that has this form is a valid argument. So those are your three most basic syllogisms. You have your modus ponens, right? If P then Q, P, therefore Q. Modus tollens, if P then Q, not Q, therefore not P. And then hypothetical syllogism, if P then Q, if Q then R, P, therefore R. Now, once you know these argument forms, you can actually use them together to come up with all sorts of different arguments. So it's really good to know these forms because your arguments can get more and more complex and you can get more involved. And these aren't all the argument forms that there are in propositional logic. But if you can just memorize this one, and this, that's already going to take you quite a ways, because at least when you're dealing with apologetics, you're not going to find arguments outside these forms many times. Usually they're going to take a modus ponens or a modus tollens argument. And I already got into the formal fallacies a little bit, But what a formal fallacy is it's just not following this proper form here, right? So we already said that this is the modus ponens argument, that I must affirm P here. I cannot affirm Q, otherwise it's an invalid argument. Now, and we already gave this example. So now let's go to the modus tollens, right, where I deny the Q, the consequent. The logical fallacy here is if I deny P, the antecedent. Okay, so I can't say if P then Q, not P, therefore not Q. That doesn't work. To see why, if it rains, the ground will be wet, and then I deny the antecedent. It did not rain, therefore the ground will not be wet. Right? That doesn't follow at all. The ground could be wet, and it maybe didn't rain. So yeah, that's a invalid argument. So yeah, once again, you cannot deny the or affirm the consequent, right? And then what is Poland's, and you cannot deny the antecedent, the P, and the modus tollens. So those are your basic formal logical fallacies. Now, this is going to be the last bit of the presentation because I don't want to overwhelm you. These are your informal fallacies. And this especially is going to be extremely important for you to be familiar with. Because when you're speaking with people, these kind of fallacies happen all the time. So it's very good to get a good handle on these informal fallacies. And the reason they're informal is because they don't strictly violate the valid logic forms. They're more kind of things you just recognize in ordinary discussion. So the first one is begging the question or arguing in a circle. So when we think of begging the question, people often use it like something begs the question, meaning that it, like a question needs to be asked, right? That isn't what begging the question properly understood actually is. Begging the question is assuming your conclusion to be true or having a circular argument. So notice this, the Bible is true because it's God's word, and we know it's God's word because the Bible says so, right? This is a circular argument because you're basing that it's God's word off of what the Bible says, and you're not giving any reasons to accept the testimony of the Bible to begin with. So any argument like this isn't going to work. Now, if you did want to say that the Bible is reliable and it's inspired by God, you could point out that if we look at the Bible, it shows evidence that it's reliable, both internal to the Bible itself. Maybe it's just kind of coherent in the text, or we notice that things in one gospel, let's say Matthew, are also confirmed in John. That could be evidence, right, that the Bible is true. And then you could say that Jesus, he had said that his apostles would spread his word. And then you could say, well, then probably the Bible is reliable, and it comes from Jesus, right? So it's inspired. So you don't have to have a circular argument to say the Bible is reliable. And in fact, it's not a good way to argue at all. Now, how this will often look in discussions with atheists, let's say, is they might say something, maybe you're talking about miracles, and they'll say miracles don't happen because there are violations of the laws of nature. And then you say, well, okay, but why are they violations of the laws of nature? And they just say, well, because that's how it's always defined. That's begging the question. They're just assuming their conclusion, but they're not giving you any reason to accept it. Or if somebody says that, God doesn't exist because it's incoherent, right? Or God doesn't make sense. Well, that's just kind of assuming your conclusion. That's not a reason to say God doesn't exist. Now, the second informal fallacy, and this is a common one, is called equivocation, which is very simple. All it is it's using the same word and it has two or more different meanings in one argument. So take this one, for example. Chickens are birds. My friend is a chicken for not going climbing. Therefore, my friend is a bird, right? This uses chickens in two different senses. Here I'm talking about the bird, and here I'm using it as a way to say that my friend was scared, right? That's an equivocation. I'm using chicken in two different ways. And equivocation is very difficult to spot sometimes because it can be really hidden. Um, so obviously it's not going to be as easy to see as it is in this example, but it's a good thing to keep an eye on when you're discussing with someone how they're using their terms and if they're using those terms consistently throughout the argument. Go ahead, Job.
Yes, on that slide with the God, all good God and evil, that's an example of equivocation. Because there's a difference between if an all good God exists, evil does not exist. Evil exists, therefore God does not exist. You changed the word there. Because there's a difference between a God that exists. He might not be all good. So it was a different term.
Yeah, that's fair. I mean, I think generally you'd need to be a little bit more charitable than that and assume that that's what they meant. But yeah,
Yeah,
right. Strictly
that's
speaking, that would be an equivocation.
that is why it's important to ask the question, what do you mean, with most words?
Right. And when you're writing out an argument, it's really important that your terms are very clear. So if I use the term God, I can't just say, God and not explain what that is. So someone, for example, I just read this series of papers on evil and God's existence, and one of the atheists, he defined God as an all good, all knowing, all powerful being, right? And then he just used God to refer to that anytime he used it. So you need to define these terms very carefully and well when you're making an argument. Otherwise, it can lead to all sorts of problems. Like this one. So this one's called amphiboly. So what it is it's using terms that could be interpreted in different ways. So it's a little bit different than equivocation because I'm not using the same term in different ways, but it could be understood differently. So take this one. Jack watched Jill sipping a cup of coffee. Is sipping a cup of coffee referring to Jill, that she was sipping the cup of coffee? Or is it referring to Jack? Did Jack sip a cup of coffee while he watched Jill? It's unclear, right? So you need to be very precise with your language. Otherwise, you're going to have these kinds of issues. Now, another one is a false dichotomy. Let me get rid of this. So this passage is from Matthew, and this is where the Pharisees are trying to trap Jesus because they know that if they ask him whether they should pay taxes to Caesar, that if he says no, then the Romans will be against him. But if he says yes, then the Jews will be against him for saying he should pay tax, right? Because the Jews, they did not like the Romans. I'll read this passage. Then the Pharisees went out and laid plans to trap him in his words. They sent their disciples to him along with the Herodians. Teacher, they said, we know that you are a man of integrity and that you teach the way of God in accordance with the truth. You aren't swayed by others because you pay no attention to who they are. Tell us then, what is your opinion? Is it right to pay the imperial tax, a tax to Caesar or not? But Jesus, knowing their evil intent, said, you hypocrites, why are you trying to trap me? Show me the coin used for paying the tax. They brought him a denarius, and he asked them, whose image is this, and whose inscription? Caesar's, they replied. Then he said to them, so give to Caesar's what is Caesar's, and give to God what is God's. So Jesus is actually refuting a false dichotomy here. Well, what is a false dichotomy? It's when you're presented with two options, right? But there's actually a middle option. So to make it very basic, someone might say that it's either black or white, and then you have something in the middle, like gray. That's kind of what this is. So here, the Pharisees and the Herodians, right? They're asking this because they're saying that either Jesus will go against the Romans or he'll go against the Jews. But here, actually, Jesus shows that he can sort of make both sides happy here. He can give to Caesar's what is Caesar's and give to God what is God's. Doing one duty of paying taxes doesn't violate the duty of serving God. They can go hand in hand. So he's actually refuting a logical fallacy here. So if this is how our Lord is thinking, right? If this is how he's responding to objections, then should we not use the same methods? Now another, and this is a really important one, and this is why it's also important to define your terms very carefully when you're speaking to people. This is called a straw man argument. This happens all the time, and this is when you object to an argument that someone hasn't actually made, or you're just misinterpreting their argument. So let's say you're arguing against an atheist, and you're saying that, oh, like, how can you be an atheist when on your view morality doesn't exist, and you probably just hate God and blah blah blah. Well, you don't actually know that all atheists are like that, right? You need to understand that particular person's view on things. Or a really common straw man argument is, take that argument I made before, right? So if anything that begins to exist has a cause, right? That was the first premise of the argument. This has been said so many times, and it's really frustrating. But people say, well, if everything has a cause, then who caused God? Well, the argument says everything that begins to exist has a cause, not that everything has a cause. So this has nothing to do with the argument you've made. But I can tell you that I've seen, I don't know, 3, 4 well-known atheists, like I think Richard Dawkins has made this. There's another atheist who's a former pastor, Dan Barker. He, in his book, brings up this objection. But clearly, they're not representing the argument properly. They don't understand it. And they're just refuting this objection, or refuting the argument, because they haven't actually looked at it. And funny note on this, that guy I mentioned, Dan Barker, has actually said that, well, because they realized that saying that everything has a cause is just a bad argument, they changed it to everything that begins to exist has a cause, to make it a better argument. That is totally false. No one has ever made that argument that everything has a cause. Nobody's ever made that argument. So if you hear this, because you probably will run into it somewhere, just know that this was never the argument in the first place. It's everything that begins to exist has a cause. Another really important fallacy, because this is really common in kind of atheist rhetoric. And I took this from Richard Dawkins' book, The God Delusion, which, if you want to sort of get a picture of what kind of popular atheism looks like, I would recommend you read that book. It is so poorly researched, poorly argued. It's just really bad. But it gives you a good handle on some more popular objections you might hear. But anyways, this is called the genetic fallacy. And listen to what Dawkins says here. If you are religious at all, it is overwhelmingly probable that your religion is that of your parents. If you were born in Arkansas in the US and you think Christianity is true and Islam false, knowing full well that you would think the opposite if you had been born in Afghanistan, you are a victim of child indoctrination. Now, Dawkins is using how people come to form their belief to say that that belief is not true. He's saying if you've you've become a Christian through indoctrination by your parents, right? Then that belief is false. That does not follow. That is completely wrong. I could have a completely true belief and form it for very bad reasons. Um, and I think I had an example of this somewhere. So yeah, take this for example, and this will be kind of weird, but maybe someone believes that tigers are dangerous, okay? And their reason for believing that tigers are dangerous is because they think that the tiger is actually a witch, and the witch is trying to cast a spell on them. So every time they see a tiger, they believe it's a witch actually trying to cast a spell on them. Well, the reasons for believing the tiger are dangerous are really stupid, right? Obviously, the tiger's not a witch, but they still have the true belief that the tiger is dangerous, right? So you can have completely bad reasons, but a true belief. So Dawkins hasn't done anything here in showing that Christianity is false, not at all. All he could say is that perhaps their reasons aren't good for why Christianity is true, but he cannot say because of this that Christianity is false. Another thing to note about this too is that Dawkins would actually have to include himself in this as well, because one can say, well, maybe if he had not been born and raised in one of the most secular places in the world, he would be he wouldn't be an atheist, right? Maybe if he was born in the U.S., he would be a Christian. So the atheist is also subject to this same criticism here. And this is a really common objection. So it's very good to recognize this when you see it. Another form of this I've seen online was someone was saying that someone formed people formed a belief in God because it had survival value. And then they used that to say that probably their beliefs are false. Well, that's just silly, right? God could have God could have made me want to believe in him so that it would help me survive, right? And God could still exist. That's not a reason why belief in God would be false. That's just silly. Um, and then I think this might be our last one or second to last one. So this is called a red herring. And all a red herring is just changing the subject, bringing up a topic that's just not relevant to the argument you're making. So this is a really common one that happens. Let's say that you're making the argument that morality makes most sense if God exists, right? And then someone says, well, are you saying that if I'm an atheist, I can't be moral? Well, no, you haven't said that at all, right? You've just been saying that, well, if someone that what makes the most sense of morality is that God exists. That's not relevant to the argument you're making. And this is a really good thing to notice when you are dealing with cults, especially because they'll bring up points that have nothing to do with what you're talking about. So maybe you're talking about the Trinity and you're showing, maybe talking about John 1:1, right? And you're saying that it shows that Jesus was God because he's the Word. And then they say, oh, well, didn't you know that at the Council of Nicaea, they refuted that and whatever, they bring up something totally off topic. Well, that has nothing to do with the argument you're making. So you need, when you're in conversation with people, try to keep them on the subject matter. Usually when someone tries to change or dodge, it's because they don't have an answer, but it's important to keep them on topic. And now our last one, and I used Richard Dawkins again. I mean, I've said this before in the group, but Richard Dawkins is my favorite new atheist. I just love using him as an example. So this is called poisoning the well. And poisoning the well is just like a personal attack on someone, or what's called an ad hominem. An ad hominem just means against the man. It's just a personal attack. And it's usually used in debate to try and undermine your interlocutor, their credibility, your opponent's credibility. So take Dawkins' quote about William Lane Craig here, our fearless leader of reasonable faith. He says, "Don't feel embarrassed if you've never heard of William Lane Craig. He parades himself as a philosopher, but none of the professors of philosophy whom I consulted had heard his name either." Okay, so when Dawkins says this, he's using it to make William Lane Craig look foolish, to say that he's not a credible philosopher. And the reason why this is a fallacy is because um, it's making it so that you're not actually going to even listen to Dr. Craig's argument, right? You're not even going to give it a proper hearing because Dawkins has already made him look foolish to begin with, right? That's a very strong rhetorical tactic in debate, trying to make somebody look foolish before they've said anything. And then no matter what they say after that point, it doesn't sound very intelligent because you've already kind of made them look dumb. So it's really important when you're listening to debates, or if you're listening to anything with Richard Dawkins, or maybe you've seen the debate that we watched earlier between Dr. Craig between John Lennox and Peter Atkins on whether science could explain everything. You need to notice when people are using this kind of tactic. Maybe they try to make Christianity look embarrassing or something like that. Or they assume that anybody who's a Christian is dumb or something like that. That's an example of trying to poison the well. They're trying to make you look stupid. But that's not a good argument. Notice that that's not a good argument to just make someone look dumb. There's no substance to that. Yeah. So those are some of your informal fallacies, and the most important ones for kind of apologetics purposes, I think. So that's the end of our presentation for today. But if anyone has any questions or comments, feel free to go ahead.